Okay, so now we have Derek Lam who's going to talk about I'd like to begin by apologizing for the title first. I'm sort of transitioning from an immature philosopher who just wanted a cool title, to a more mature philosopher who wants to have a responsible, helpful title of the paper. So if the mature me were in charge when I submit the paper, I would have say the title is Metaphysics of Quantity and the Limit of Phenomenal Conceptuality. So it would be more helpful and informative. So let me begin by giving you a little bit of intellectual background of this paper. And so this paper is part of a bigger, more ambitious project that I'm working on. So currently I'm researching, my main research project is about thinking about various aspects of reality that are so rich and dense in various ways in comparison with our conceptual resources, such that I argue, I want to show we have to accept some limit to our thoughts. There are certain thoughts that we cannot literally think, but at most can only pretend to think. So that's a kind of ambitious project that I'm working on, the limit of our thoughts. And today I'm not going to talk about that ambitious project. Instead, I'm just going to take a little part of the project and limit our attention to one aspect of reality that has that kind of richness, our phenomenal experience, phenomenal quality. So, philosophers who study the nature of our phenomenal character talks about, they disagree about whether phenomenal characters are feasible, non-feasible, subjective, non-subjective, intentional, non-intentional, and so on and so forth. These are all discussion about feature of our phenomenal experience, feature of our phenomenology. And there's one kind of question that's left out by this kind of discussion. It's the ontological status of phenomenology. Well, that is, suppose there are such thing as phenomenal character. What kind of things are they? What kind of ontological categories do they belong to? So tell me if I'm wrong, but as far as I can tell, there isn't much extensive discussion on this kind of issue. And although there are no extensive discussion on this kind of issue, the ontological status of phenomenology, occasionally we'll see philosophers making certain claims about the ontological category. So, for example, Byrne and Hugo in 2003, and more recently Schroeder in 2010 says something like, in slightly different ways, phenomenal characters of our experience are magnitudes. So magnitudes exactly that works. So you would wonder, what exactly do they mean by magnitudes? So magnitude, to understand magnitudes, it has to be understood in contrast with quantity. Quantities are properties that come in degree. For example, temperature is a quantity, mass is a quantity, speed is a quantity, and these properties, for example, temperature comes in degree. And to talk about magnitudes, it's just another way to talk about these degrees of quantity. So temperature comes in degree, it comes in magnitudes. It's just two different ways to talk about the same thing. So when we understand what magnitudes is, you can see why it seems intuitive to talk about our phenomenal qualities as some sort of magnitudes, because let's look at a very typical example of phenomenal character, pain. It seems to be very obvious that it's a kind of property that comes in degree. So it seems very natural to think that often phenomenal characters are magnitudes. But you don't really have to think that, of course, you don't really have to think that all of our phenomenal characters are magnitudes. For example, if you think that there are cognitive phenomenology, you think there's a what it's like to think about 2 + 2 = 4, then unlike the case of paint, it doesn't really seem obvious at all that this kind of what it's like comes in degree like paint does. So you don't have to think that all of our phenomenology is quantity and magnitude, but at least I think we can agree about one thing, is that it seems intuitive that a huge chunk of our phenomenal experience are magnitudes. But I guess that's the end of it. It seems to me that philosophers who refers to our phenomenal qualities, phenomenal characters as magnitude, didn't even bother to explain a little bit more their assumed metaphysics of quantity. Like, it's as if they think that although our phenomenologies are quantities and magnitudes, whatever quantities and magnitudes are, wouldn't affect, has nothing to say, has nothing to do with our theorizing our phenomenology. So it seems to me pretty weird that on the one hand they think that these are quantities, but they have no one even trying to like explicate their metaphysics of quantity clearly. What do they think these quantities are? And this is exactly what I'm going to do today. I'm trying to do a little bit of a metaphysics of quantities, to argue for certain metaphysical thesis about the nature of quantities and magnitudes, and apply to understand some of our phenomenal experience, and show that actually by applying a proper metaphysics of quantities, there are some interesting upshot in the physicalism versus anti-physicalism debate. And it is actually a mistake for them to just say that, oh, they're magnitudes and move on. So let's step back, as I said, step back from phenomenology in general and talk about metaphysics of quantities in general. So there are a lot of things we can say about metaphysics of quantity, but I'll just focus on a little bit which would be relevant to bring up the upshot of my paper. So first of all, as I said, quantity comes in degree or comes in magnitudes. The quantity and the magnitude stand in the determinable and determinants relation. Assume this seems right. Just like red and scarlet stand in determinable determinants relationship. And furthermore, I like to argue that those magnitudes of a quantity are maximally determinate ways of instantiating quantity. So to motivate this claim, think about a glass of water. So suppose it has the property of having certain temperature, true, and it has also the determinate property of being very hot, and it also has the further property of being between 90 to 110 degrees Celsius. And furthermore, it also has the property of being exactly 95 degrees Celsius. Although it has 3 determinate properties of having temperature, we won't say that it has 3 temperature. We won't say it has 3 magnitudes of temperature. Instead, although it has all these 4 properties, it has only 1 magnitude of temperature. And which one? I think the most natural way to think about it is that the maximally determinate way to have temperature is the magnitude of glass of water, namely 95 degrees Celsius exactly. That's the magnitude. So although it's true of the glass of water that is between 90 degrees and 110 degrees Celsius, it's not an extra magnitude temperature. So that's an extra metaphysical claim about quantity. And I leave the phrase maximally determinate ways pretty intuitive, because, for example, you might think that, oh, being 95 degrees Celsius and is in my mouth is a more determinate properties than simply being 95 degrees Celsius. But I think it seems intuitively clear to me that the property being 95 degrees Celsius and in my mouth is not a more determinate ways to instantiate temperature. So that's why I say I leave the idea of maximally determined ways, this phrase, largely intuitive. So once we have this picture of what magnitudes and what quantities and its magnitudes are, I want to introduce a proportionality requirement for causation. So first of all, if we think that there are quantities and magnitudes at all, that is, there are properties that are determinable and there are all these various degrees of determinants of the quantities, we are already accepting that reality consists of layers of determinacy. So some people deny that, but if you deny that, then basically you already deny that there are these quantity and magnitude structure in the world. But since we're assuming that there are such things, after all, we think that phenomenology are this kind of property. So we're already assuming that the world consists of layers of determinacy. Second, if we don't think that there are widespread causal overdetermination in reality. And third, if we sort of assume that the bottom layer, well, I know some of you would deny that, but I assume that we don't want the bottom layer of reality, the ultimate, most determined layer of reality, monopolizing all the causal work. We want to think that certain determinable also have some sort of causal work done. If we think that these three claims seems to be intuitive, then I think that it's reasonable to accept what I call proportionality requirement for causation. That is, namely, a claim that a cause of an effect has to be proportional in terms of determinacy. So I formulate it in a more rigorous way in my handout in terms of two conditional, which in a talk I don't think I need to read it out. So if you want to, it's my handout. So I think based on these three claims, we have this proportionality requirement for causation. One example is, I think this requirement is pretty well known. So, but one example is, I suppose I walk into a room, I yell "Merry Christmas," and my cat wakes up. Yelling "Merry Christmas" is not proportional cause to my cat's waking up, because I could have yelled "Happy Halloween" and my cat would still have woken up. And simply saying that the fact that I'm making some sound is also not a proportional cause for my cat's waking up, because I could have just whispered very quietly and my cat won't wake up. So the proportional cause of my cat's waking up is me yelling, no matter what I'm yelling. So that's an example, an application of proportionality requirement. So once we have this proportionality requirement, I think that I want to argue that we are justified inductively to accept this principle, which I call the causal profile of magnitudes, a metaphysical principle about magnitudes. So the principle being instantiation of properties that are not magnitudes, which is not a degree of some quantities, cannot be caused by instantiation of magnitudes. So by inductively, I mean we can just reflect on all the cases we have encountered in our life and all the cases that we think we can realistically expect in the actual world. For example, I once mistakenly put my hand on a hot stove. I yell at that. Me yelling is not a magnitude. It's a property that either I have it or don't. And in that case, it seems true that the specific degree of temperature of the stove is not the proportional cause of my yelling, because as long as it's extremely hot, I would yell. It doesn't really matter which specific temperature it is. So I think that when we reflect on all the cases we've encountered in our life in the actual world, and given the proportionality requirement of causation, it seems quite clear to me that any specific magnitude would not be a proportional cause for instantiation of some properties which are not magnitudes. So when I present this claim to people, when I talk to people, well, this is the first time I present it, but when I talk to people about this reasoning, most people, a lot of people will respond by saying that, look, that can't be right. Let's imagine that, I can totally imagine a machine that will just punch me in my face whenever the room is at a very specific temperature, like say 70 degrees Fahrenheit, or 70, not 70, Fahrenheit makes more sense. So isn't it then a case against my claim? Because that would be a case where a very specific degree of temperature causing me being punched in my face, which is a property that is not a magnitude, being punched in the face. So if you have this kind of worry, I think you shouldn't, because it's important to notice that what I was offering is an inductive argument, and you can't really diffuse an inductive argument by conceiving a case. For example, if I look at a lot of red tomato and inductively conclude that all tomatoes are red, you can't argue against me by saying that, oh, I can imagine a black tomato. That's not really going to work. And that's why you can come up with kind of example, but those kind of examples better not be just conceived examples. But we can talk more about it if you think my response is not totally fair. So, so furthermore, I want to make a further claim that given any concept C, the possession of C or having C at your disposal is a mental property that people can have, whatever concept you have in mind. And that kind of property are not magnitudes. For example, let's talk about the concept of rabbit. I have this concept at my disposal. I can have entertain thoughts about rabbits whenever I want. So I have this concept at my disposal. So I have the mental property of having the concept rabbit. And I think this mental property is clearly not a degree of any quantity, not like degree of temperature, not like degree of mass or speed. So, so I want to argue that concept which has possession, no matter what concepts you're talking about, is a mental property, but it's a property that is not a magnitude. So when we combine what I've been talking about earlier, namely the causal profile of magnitude that you cannot cause the instantiation of non-magnitude, and now I argue for the claim that whatever concept we're thinking about, the possession of certain concept is not a magnitude, then we have a conclusion that there's a causal barrier between magnitudes in general. We're not talking about phenomenology yet. We're just talking about some metaphysics of quantity in general. Between the magnitudes, maybe it's temperature, maybe it's specific speed, maybe it's specific mass, and our conceptual resources. And the basic reason is because those magnitudes being maximally determined ways in substantial quantity are just too specific to be a proportional cause of any of our concepts possession, or possession of any concept. All right, so we have done some elementary metaphysics of quantity. Now, let's apply what we've talked about to phenomenology in general, since we said that some philosophers tend to casually say something like that, casually assert that phenomenal characters are quantity. So let's see what it would mean now that we know more clearly what magnitudes and quantities are. So first of all, if we think that, if we take that seriously and we think that there's a distinction between a quantity and all the magnitudes or degrees of the quantities, just like temperature, we have to distinguish temperature from all the degrees of temperature as determinants. And if we take seriously the view that phenomenal characters, some of them are magnitudes, we should make a similar distinction in the case of phenomenology. So let me use the most simple case, pain, as an example. So we should actually distinguish between pain, according to phenomenal qualities, and the various degrees of pain, or magnitudes of pain you can get in. So I'll call these magnitudes phenomenal feelings that we feel. So we should make the distinction between pain, in general, like temperature, and various magnitudes of pain, just like there's magnitudes of temperature. Secondly, since we are applying the model of quantities to understand phenomenology, pain in this case in particular, just like what we said earlier about quantities in general, we should think that these phenomenal feelings, which are magnitudes of pain, for example, are maximally determined ways to instantiate phenomenal qualities, in this case pain. So each magnitude of pain is a maximally determined way to have pain. So this is just to parallel what we talk about when we talk about temperature and mass. It's just exactly the same. And again, whenever I explain this view to people, people usually frown upon this idea that the phenomenal feeling has to be maximally determinate. But I think you can just run exactly the same argument when I argue for the determinacy of temperature here. For example, if I break my leg, I instantiate the property of being in pain, being very painful, being more than sort of painful, and being a specific degree of pain, say pain 7. So I instantiate all these properties. But of course, when I break my leg, I don't have more than one pain. I experience one pain. And the more natural way to say, just like temperature case, is to say that the pain that I feel is the maximally determinate way in the same shape pattern. So it's exactly the same as I talked about when I talk about temperature. So so of course, since this is exactly parallel, we can see that if what I said earlier was reasonable, then we should conclude that there's similarly a causal barrier between our conceptual resources and our phenomenal feelings as a particular kind of magnitudes. So just applying exactly the same argument in the case of phenomenal feelings, we'll have this conclusion. And so what this has to do with philosophy of mind, I think, is that this conclusion about the causal barrier between our phenomenal feelings and our concepts is that it has certain upshot, maybe not that surprising or not that ambitious, but to me it's sort of interesting upshot to certain ways in which physicalists has been trying to conceptualize or theorize the explanatory gap, namely the gap between our physicalist way of, thinking about a micro, namely the gap between an objective way of thinking about brain states and thinking about phenomenal experience via certain phenomenal concepts. So there's a gap in the sense that having those physical thought would immediately requires us to have certain phenomenal thoughts, because having those phenomenal thoughts would require us first to have encountered or experienced those experiences. So, one of the most prominent strategy for the physicalists to explain, well, for the non-reductionalists, this explanatory gap between the physical concepts and the phenomenal concepts should imply, according to them, implies a metaphysical gap between the mental and the physical. But the physicalists, of course, don't want to say that, and a very popular way for them to deal with this, to explain away this metaphysical conclusion, is to say that actually the explanatory gap is purely conceptual and epistemic, and they usually, one very popular way for them to say that is to say that we have physical concept on one hand, and the phenomenal concepts are actually demonstrative concepts, and due to certain feature of demonstrative concept that we can't have demonstrative concept before we encounter the object of the demonstrative concepts. This explains why there is a distinct feature, epistemic feature of the two kinds of concepts and two ways of thinking. So this is just some basics of the phenomenal concept strategy. But I assume we all know, are very familiar with all these. But the point being, for my purpose, is that this physicalist strategy to make sense of the explanatory gap without getting non-reductive physicalism relies heavily on the possibility of there being demonstrative concept about our phenomenal experiences, our phenomenal feelings. And I think that if what I was arguing was right, that there's a causal barrier between our conceptual resources and our phenomenal feelings, given what I talked about the qualities, then actually there can't be that kind of concept about our phenomenal feelings. That is, the kind of phenomenal concept that physicalists require for the strategy to work can't possibly exist for them from that perspective. And here's why. So there are two kinds of demonstrative concepts: the simple demonstrative, simply this or that, and complex demonstrative, this app, that app. And if simple demonstrative about an object O is impossible, then complex demonstrative about O would also be impossible, because simple demonstrative is simply a component of complex demonstrative. So if simple demonstrative, if O is the kind of thing that you cannot refer to it by simple this, then certainly it's impossible for you to refer to it as this F or this G or whatever complex demonstrative you have in mind. And now, since we're thinking about the issue from a physicalist perspective, we have to endorse some sort of physicalist view about what the mental representations are. And for all the views out there, like Millikan's view, Jansky's view, Fodor's view, at least for simple mental representations, simple concepts like simple demonstratives, they require that for there to be a simple mental representation about certain object O, the kind of object O has to be within the causal range of that simple mental representation. Now, this requirement doesn't apply to complex mental representation, but for these views to work, they usually have to require that for simple mental representations. And that, in particular, includes simple demonstrative concepts. So it means if our phenomenal feelings are beyond the causal reach of our simple concept, and in particular, our simple demonstrative concepts, and if we can't have complex demonstrative without the possibility of having simple demonstrative concepts, that means if I'm right that there's a causal barrier between phenomenal feelings and our concepts, simple concepts in general, then from the perspective of physicalist view about mental representation, we could possibly have demonstrative concept about our phenomenal feelings, which are maximally determined by existential quantities. And that is why I think that, as a conclusion, I think from what we have seen, there are simply no physicalist's friendly account of demonstrative concepts that allows demonstrative concepts to be about our phenomenal feelings, as long as we have the proper metaphysics of quantities. And if that is right, then it means that once we spend time thinking about what proper metaphysics of quantity is, it proves out one of the most popular way physicists trying to explain what interplanetary gap is. And I think that is an important upshot from metaphysics of quantity that has been ignored by philosophers who just casually talk about phenomenal fields as magnitude without thinking more carefully, spell out, articulate more clearly what magnitudes and quantities are. And I think that, that's